Okay, alrighty, gang. Howdy. Creating a video here on our final module of our semester, in which we are looking at rhetoric as virtuality. And by virtuality, what I'm referring to is we used to refer to the internet as the virtual realm, virtual reality, right? Like this idea of synthetic, not real. But more specifically, we're thinking about it as digital, as this realm of kind of onlineness and the way in which how more and more of our lives are lived online and through online social platforms, and how much of that world is both fake and real, right? So it's fabricated because it's being kind of mediated and shaped by these things called algorithms and big data and so on. But also it's this kind of, it's also real, right? And so it's the space that we engage in that exists in kind of nowhere and sort of everywhere. So the definition of, or the characterization of the virtual that I tend to rely on is sort of Deleuzian. This French philosopher had this idea of the virtual as the real but not yet actual. So it's the realm of possibility, of becoming, of constant newness and change and growth, and especially when you're thinking about the realm of most of what we're doing with these things is we're looking at stuff and we're hearing stuff, and so it's sort of all up in our brains, but it does affect our limbic systems, our kind of visceral affect sensations, right? And so it's kind of all coming through the brain. It's like that line in the Matrix, like, do you die in real life? If you die in the Matrix, then Morpheus says the body can't live without the mind makes it real, right? And so the internet, to the online kind of world, is both real and phony, fabricated in the sense that it's images and lights and energy and electricity and all that kind of stuff, and it's sort of fake, real in terms of how we react with it and how it affects us. So that's what we mean by virtual, is the realm of the digital, essentially, and this kind of constantly expanding, constantly moving and changing kind of realm of our lives that we increasingly live in. Okay, and so I wanted to try out a couple of new readings here. There's still not a huge amount of really good stuff in rhetoric on the digital kind of revolution, although more and more stuff's coming out all the time. And I wanted to go back and look at a couple of pieces by folks who are adjacent to communication, or Lawrence Lessig, the first one, Code is Law. He's a legal scholar. As far as I know, he doesn't know too much about communication or rhetoric, but there's a lot of rhetoric kind of throbbing below the surface of that short piece. And then Ian Bogost, writing, I think he was writing for The Atlantic. Yeah, he's been writing for them for a while. This is going back to 2015. The first one by Lessig goes back to 99. So that's pretty early, early internet kind of realm. And then Bogost, 2015. Things are well underway in terms of our kind of current reality. And Bogost is a unique figure one of the rare individuals who can speak computer language very well. This guy knows how to code and create apps, and is also a really sharp critical communication, cultural kind of scholar. And he actually wrote a really great book. I might have it in here somewhere. It's called Persuasive Games. So he wrote a whole book on computers and video games from the perspective of rhetoric. So persuasive games, and he talks a fair bit at the beginning of that book about rhetoric and the history of rhetoric. So he's really valuable because he's someone who's very attuned to the rhetorical dynamics and properties of computation and computer processing and so on, and has really useful things to say about computers. He's someone who writes a lot about computers and computation and all this kind of digital world, but is also pretty critical of it all. And so that's why I like him. So we'll start briefly with Lessig, Code is Law. Now, again, because we're kind of coming at this fresh, I like to end the semester when we're kind of doing a like history of rhetoric. I like to end as currently as possible. So we're ending off. The next reading next week is about artificial intelligence. Big surprise there. That's like the big thing right now, obviously, and it's going to be already kind of is game changing and is going to continue to just like revolutionize on top of the revolution of the digital technology that we're still trying to kind of catch up with and reckon with in terms of like mental health, social health, psychological health, all that kind of stuff. So things are moving rapidly in leaps and bounds, and they're just going to get crazier. Now, where's the rhetoric in all this, or how do we want to be thinking about this as rhetorical? Well, as I was talking to the gang in class last week, we want to be thinking about broadly the kind of insights of Marshall McLuhan, the media theorist, the Canadian media theorist, who said, you're probably familiar with his line, the medium is the message, meaning that more important than in terms of a mediated communication, whether it's a piece of paper or writing a letter or it's a text message, you know, on your messaging app or a computer or telegraph or whatever, you know, like mediums convey goods and information from here to here kind of idea. And McLuhan's insight was to suggest that it's not just the content, it's not the thing inside the container. Think about a shipping container and what's inside the shipping container as the content. And you know, media theory mostly was always interested in the content, the message, the substance of this communication. McLuhan suggested that the medium or the technology itself that is used to transport that idea, that message, that communication from here to here shapes and affects the message and is effectively the message in terms of how it is that we use these technologies and how they kind of use us, right? So Burke talked a lot about language, and he said that we use language, but language also uses us in terms of ideology, in terms of like, you know, words that we can't say and phrases and so on. So we are a part of it, even though we create it and use it, but it also kind of uses us. And we can think about technology, I think, in much the same way, right? So in class, we were talking about, you know, the medium. I asked the class, like, has anyone ever broken up with someone through text message or been broken up with through text message? And everyone kind of cringed, right? Like, that's bad. So that kind of reveals the point. It's like, well, why is it bad? Because that medium is understood to be a medium of like quick, casual, like just, you know, emotion, emojis, like just short and brief and, you know, superficial. And, you know, when we get those long, drawn out text messages, we all kind of roll our eyes, right? And so I asked them, like, what about email? Have you ever been broken up by email, or have you ever done it? And again, the big, you know, groans and like, are you kidding me? So I think inside of that reaction is a kind of an understanding that the medium shapes the message. McLuhan said it kind of is the message, right? And so, you know, you write a handwritten letter nicely using a nice pen and, you know, nice paper, thick paper, and you get the wax seal and you send it off. There's a formality, there's a slowness, there's an intimacy, there's a seriousness to that, right? Versus a text message, which is like thumb, you know, like we have the lowest of expectations in terms of that form. Okay, so if we're thinking about the medium itself as affecting the outcome or the impact of the message, then I think it gets easier to think about code. When we think about code, we're thinking about the lines of inputs that are used to create the computations that govern and shape our lives. We can think of code as a medium that also shapes the impact of the message, okay? So Lessig is not yet talking about algorithms. We are going to start talking about algorithms more and more like around the time that Bogost, which is like, you know, 15, 16 years later, that's when algorithm and the kind of awareness of them started to become more prominent. Lessig is just talking about code, and he's not using the word rhetoric, but it's pretty obvious that he's taking a rhetorical approach here because he's talking about the architecture of the internet. And code, he says, is the architecture of the internet. He says that code regulates. Now, when we think of regulate, we tend to think of like constrain, right? You can't do that. You can't, like shut it down, minimize, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. His point is like regulating is more in terms of like managing or shaping or channeling or funneling. So what code does is it determines, in that third paragraph, it determines how easy it is to protect privacy or how easy it is to censor speech. It determines whether or, right? And so the point of code is that it's funneling us this way or this way, right? And these codes are written by people who are humans, who have values, who code those values into their software and into the experiences that we have with these programs and devices, okay? So even though he's not talking about persuasion and rhetoric, the fact that these codes that exist behind the screens, behind the scenes, behind the screens, right? Doing all of this work of showing us certain information and not showing us other information, I think we have some sense of the kind of the sorting and organizing effects of algorithms. What we see on our Instagram page or our TikTok pages or whatever is highly conditioned and determined, as he says, by what the code knows about our prior behavior. And so the code or the algorithms are always sorting, prioritizing, filtering. That is a rhetorical enterprise because it's sort of pre-persuading. It's sort of saying the algorithm, the inside, the guts of the computation, knows what you're going to like or not like or get a reaction out of or engagement. Maybe it's something that upsets you or angers you or something like that. But it keeps your attention, and that's increasingly what the code and the algorithms are being designed to do. So that's kind of the gist of this first paper. Again, he's writing this at a time when these kinds of insights were pretty rare. And I like what he says on the second page in that last paragraph before the new section, other architectures. He says, no thought is more dangerous to the future of liberty in cyberspace than this faith in freedom guaranteed by the code. For the code is not fixed. The architecture of cyberspace is not given, right? We tend to think of it as this perfectly wrought world because we don't see what's going on behind the scenes, behind the screens, right? But it's not given. It's not guaranteed. It didn't have to be this way. It certainly has changed a lot already, right? So his point is like we should be aware of the constructedness, the rhetoricity. Again, he doesn't use that word, but we could. The rhetoricity, the rhetorical dynamics and quality of code and online interactions. He says in that second small paragraph under the new section, are there architectures, right in the middle, what the architecture enables and how it limits its control are choices. Choices are made by programmers. Programmers are guided by project managers who are guided by senior folk who are guided by the upper leadership and the CEOs, the C-suites, and they're, always chasing the money and worried about the money, and they got to, make their money for their investors. And so, the pressure's coming down to create whatever kind of code-based outcome is desired. And that basically means engagement, right? More of our attention. That's where the codes are taking us. So basically the last kind of chunk that Lessig is talking about here is this business of values. And so the way that the codes architect our experiences online are implicitly promoting certain values over other values. So he notes throughout that one of the big values of the internet all along has been essentially anonymity, not making it very difficult for people to be tracked and certified, right? And that's a kind of a choice. Didn't have to go that way. So we can find values. We can find values more recently today about engagement at all costs, attention, engagement, stickiness. Like this is the stuff that really has driven the values that have driven the coding decisions over the last decade and a half or so. So he notes the importance of value toward the end here. I like this. There was a good line in here about, the last page, the first kind of big paragraph that begins, our choice is not between regulation and no regulation, right? So when we think about regulation, it's not like total freedom over here and complete crackdown, governance over there. He says, code itself regulates. It's not like there's code that doesn't regulate and there's code that does regulate. Code regulates in the way that language regulates, because it prioritizes and it emphasizes and it sorts and organizes and selects, okay? So code is always regulating. In the and we could use the word, instead of regulation, persuasion, right, or influence. Pretty much the same. Regulate in the sense of manage and shape and control. That's very rhetorical. So his point basically is we need to be aware of the fact that codes are rhetorical. These are constructions that are carrying certain human values, whether or not the programmers understand that. You know, there's lots of stuff out there about the bias of algorithms, and what they show us is based on bad assumptions about stuff that's happened in the past, right? Because a lot of these trainings, especially for AI, the training is happening on prior discourse, prior texts, prior documents, but those aren't perfect. You know, the example I often think about is, I heard about this one on training the AI systems on showing images of clocks or watches, right? So, you look at an ad for a watch, and usually the hands, the analog watch, the hands are like here and here. What is that like? Sort of the steering wheel, 10 and 2 or something like that. There's a common placement for the hands just because it looks symmetrical or whatever. And because there's so many images of watches using that hand formation, you train the AI system on the existing documents, and so it starts to think that all watches and all time just looks like this. And I've heard that, if you ask an AI engine, show me a watch that says, 4:15 or something like this, it's still going to give you this because that's what it knows, right? So there are blind spots and blindnesses that get built into these systems, in these programs, and that's kind of what makes them rhetorical, because there are authors, right? The code writers, the programmers are the authors, the inventors, the rhetors that are coding specific priorities into these devices, and then those devices end up impacting us and encouraging us and discouraging us in certain ways. Now, let me just shut up there because I'm already at 15 minutes. And the Cathedral of Computation piece kind of extends Lessig's ideas in a somewhat more specific way. And so again, Bogost is talking about algorithmic culture. And so, the warning that Lessig was giving in that early piece was basically like, hey, gang, be aware, code is the architecture of our times. It governs and regulates more and more of our lives. So let's be careful about the kinds of values that are coded into our programs and our devices. And now, 16 years later, Bogost is saying, okay, we have completely deified computation. We have turned computers into gods, and we think of algorithms as the angels of God in terms of what they reveal and encourage and so on. And his whole point, again, similar to Lessig, is let's not think of these things as perfect, right? Let's not think of computational processes as inherently neutral and unbiased and just doing the good work of making life more efficient and convenience. Convenience itself, by the way, is a value. I keep on talking about a paper that I want to write someday about the tyranny of convenience, or the destructiveness of the idea of convenience. And this is one of the chief master values of our age, going back to, I don't know, when did speed and efficiency become the overall kind of thing that we care most about? I study the food system. Convenience. Food needs to be cheap and accessible and easy to make and easy to get and quick. Why? Why? Because God deems it so? No, because for whatever reason we think that that's the most important thing because we're busy Americans, got to make money. Okay, but think about the damage that we have done to our environment, to animals, to laborers, to our bodies. RFK is all the rage right now because he's shouting loudly about the damages of the food system. And some of what he's saying makes a ton of sense. Some of it is kooky, right? But nevertheless, this is sort of where we're at. We've built these values into the architecture that we are surrounded by. And increasingly, that architecture is digital. All right, so Bogost is talking about this devotional approach that we take to algorithmic culture. We just sort of worship these machines and what they can do, and we think that they're kind of perfect. I was listening to a podcast with Jaron Lanier, who's one of the godfathers of AI. He's got a couple of books out that are really good. Really, really smart guy in terms of digital stuff and AI stuff. And his big argument in this this interview I was listening to was that we need to basically not deify AI, right? We need not even just deify it, not even humanize it. You know, this whole thing of like, I saw this online recently, is how many people say thank you, please and thank you when they're asking AI to do stuff, right? And it's like, that feels like you're talking to a human. And I do this myself. Would you please do this for me? Or, hey, thank you. Can you do it again? And I just read something about like how many millions of dollars in server power and like natural energy and resources are used up making these AI engines seem nice and polite, right? So like we're actually wasting energy by engaging these computers as if they were human. And that's kind of Bogost's idea here, is like, why are we treating these things like they're gods and we worship the computers? I think Steve Jobs, you know, like the way that he was able to create these devices that are so enticing and beautiful and smooth and easy to work with, and it creates a almost religious-like experience of, holy smokes, this thing can do anything and it's magical, you know? So he talks about this idea of a theological reversal of the Enlightenment. This is on the second page toward the bottom. This notion, you know, the Enlightenment was supposed to be about reason over mysticism. And now he says we're turning our scientific, you know, products and instruments into objects of worship, which is weird because science was meant to kind of get away from worship and just be about rational. But it's weird how, and interesting how we keep kind of imputing human and godlike attributes to these devices and these machines. And so again, Jaron Lanier was saying, like, let's stop thinking of these stupid things as people or having human qualities. They're just fancy calculators, essentially. Like, that's it. That's all that we're dealing with here. So can we get out of our brains that they have, you know, identities or like, let's talk with them and make friends with them, and, you know, pretty soon we're going to have like AI boyfriends and girlfriends, and like we're going in that direction. He's like, my goodness, these are just machines, like, you know, your lawnmower outside kind of idea. So he talks about, you know, how computers have become our idols. He goes through a little bit of a interesting history of the metaphors we use to talk about, you know, the kind of dominant arrangements and organizations of our era, and we tend to draw on the kind of the main industry examples, like the machine, and then becomes the computer, and now it's the algorithm. We use these as these kind of metaphors, but he wants to just show how it's just that, it's just a metaphor. So on page 70 here, there's good stuff. He's talking about how we think about algorithms as like flowers. He says the canonical algorithm is not just a model sequence, but a concise and efficient one. In its ideological mythic incarnation, the ideal algorithm is thought to be some flawless little trifle of lithe computer code, processing data into tapestry like a robotic silkworm, a perfect flower, elegant and pristine, simple and singular, a thing you can hold in your palm and caress, a beautiful thing, a divine one. Some nice writing there. But he's talking about our kind of worship of the algorithm, which figures out magically just what we need and want to see or whatever. He's like, no. These things are clunky, human-driven tools that, as he says in the next line there, but just as the machine metaphor gives us a distorted view of automated manufacturers, prime mover, so the algorithmic metaphor gives us a distorted and theological view of computational action. And then he continues a little bit later to say that on this quote here, the metaphors, like metaphors, algorithms are simplifications and distortions. They're caricatures, right? So there was something that was going on just in the last few days. I'm starting to follow some AI channels, just trying to kind of keep up on what's happening. And the latest thing is, like, if you show an AI bot an image and say, repeat this image exactly 70 different times, just say, now give me the same image exactly. Give me the same image exactly. Just copy. It keeps changing. It keeps changing and changing and changing over time. And so it's not perfect. It doesn't even know itself. And there's these wild examples of like you start with a picture of a person and it gets bigger and skinnier and then it turns Asian and white. And it's like, why is it moving in all of these different directions when you're just asking it to copy itself perfectly, right? So there are all these slippages and it's kind of clunky and it's kind of like a simplification or a distortion. And so we always need to be careful about convincing ourselves that what we're seeing is the truth or the perfect outcome or whatever, right? There's a lot of spit and gum and tape behind the scenes, so to speak. Gets into big data. He's talking about Netflix and algorithms and so on. He says on the page 11, if algorithms aren't gods, what are they instead? He says, like metaphors, algorithms are simplifications or distortions or caricatures. They take a complex system from the world and abstract it into processes that capture some of that system's logic and discard others. Right? So they kind of distort. They kind of reduce and simplify and exaggerate at the same time. And that's this idea of a caricature. A caricature is a simplification and an exaggeration, right? It's like you do an impersonation of Donald Trump. You're going to focus on a couple of his features. You do his little gestures and sound, and you kind of reduce him down, and you blow it up at the same time, right? So at the very end, he talks about, why are we kind of thinking about this? He says, this attitude blinds us, this sort of theological attitude blinds us in two ways. First, it allows us to chalk up any kind of computational social change as predetermined and inevitable. And I can certainly vouch for this because when I talk to my students, and I have been now for a better part of a decade or so, talking about digital influence and, the scraping up of our private personal data and using that to sell products back to us and this idea of like privacy intrusion and the kind of the exaggerated effects of digital influence and so on. And usually students are just like, yeah, what are you going to do? It's like, it is what it is. Well, it doesn't have to be this way. And it always wasn't this way. It didn't start out this way. So things have moved in a particular direction. And I think more and more we're seeing the negative outcomes and effects of algorithmic sorting and prioritization, because it's really kind of like this whiplash experience of moving from the digital life to the real life. I'm always amused as a food guy at you see these huge lineups outside of some restaurant. It's like, oh, I guess that one went viral. I guess some influencer said that this is the greatest whatever. And then you've got lines down 5 blocks, even if the place itself is like okay. But the influencer, for whatever reason, managed to like get enough eyeballs to see the video that says this place has the most whatever. And now you've got, these crazy lineups, right? So it's this weird kind of, again, simplification because the place might not be that great, but it's an exaggerated effect at the same time. So it doesn't have to be that way. Second, it makes us forget the particular computational systems are abstractions, caricatures of the world, one perspective among many. So we always got to remind ourselves, there's a lot of this on Instagram. Social media is not reality, but like all of that is not reality. And it sort of is reality because it makes it real. Right, because we follow and like and engage and sort of becomes real, and that's this element of the virtual. It's somewhere between the possible and the actual, right? All right, so that's a pretty good set of pieces to kind of get us into this business of what is, how do we think about computers as persuasion? How do we think about algorithms as rhetoric? How do we think about these devices that surround us and screens everywhere and big data gathering all over the place? What's it all about? Well, it's about getting more and more specific information that speaks to us in very specific ways and moves us around in very specific ways. But we always got to be asking ourselves, do I want to be moved in this way? Is this really what I want to be nudged by and moved around, right? So I've been saying this for years now, and this is the last thing I'll say, is like we cannot but be influenced by something. So let's try to choose our influences in a healthy way, right? And so is that the device? Is it the platform? Is it the, what kind of algorithm do you want serving you up this sort of digital fruit nonstop, right? Trying to understand the nature of how particular algorithms work on particular platforms and what they're doing is, I think, the first step to like good, critical, engaged consumption and citizenship in these spaces, because just to assume that everything is hunky-dory and neutral is just not okay. It's not sufficient. It's not good enough, because these things are pushing us around in major ways. All right? So we will continue with a 1 or 2 readings. I think it's just one more reading on... No, maybe 2. Sorry. Anyway, we're going to be talking about AI next, and then that's it. So... as always, send me any questions or holler or come by and chat, and hope everyone's doing well, and we're almost there. Peace.